If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Continuing, the sun was beginning to set over the horizon of Charleston, South Carolina, when Bernard Allister's car pulled up in front of the colonial mansion perched atop the historic city. The driver opened the door and the maestro stepped out, exhausted after a 2-month tour of Europe. The house, an architectural relic from the 18th century perfectly restored, displayed its colorful walls and carved wooden windows, characteristics of the region that so enchanted tourists. For Bernard, it was simply the home that sheltered his greatest treasure, his 6-year-old daughter Clara. As he walked through the well-tended garden, he felt the sea breeze carrying that characteristic aroma unique to South Carolina, a blend of sea salt, tropical flowers, and history. Bernard smiled, anticipating Clara's tight hug, which always greeted him with a run whenever he returned from his trips. Since the passing of Marianne, his first wife, 4 years ago, due to complications during surgery, little Clara was his only link to the pure joy that had once filled that house. But upon opening the door, it wasn't the usual sound of laughter or hurried footsteps that greeted him. A strange silence hung in the air, broken only by a harsh voice coming from the music room. Bernard walked slowly, following the sound, and came across a scene that made his heart freeze. Deborah, his current wife, was tightly gripping Clara's arm, reprimanding her with an aggression he had never witnessed. "How many times do I have to repeat that this room is no place for your games? Your father's instruments are worth more than this entire house," Deborah yelled, as little Clara, with tears in her eyes, held a crumpled drawing in her free hand. "I just wanted to play the piano like Daddy taught me," Clara murmured, her voice almost inaudible. The girl, with her curly hair and tanned skin like her father's, seemed to have shrunk in size before the imposing figure of her stepmother. "Deborah!" Bernard's voice, normally as serene as the compositions that made him famous, now had a grave tone that made both women turn their gazes to him. "What is going on here?" Deborah immediately released Clara's arm, her expression transforming into a mask of false concern. "Bernard, darling, what a wonderful surprise. We weren't expecting you today." Clara ran into her father's arms, who enveloped her in a protective embrace. Bernard noticed red marks on his daughter's delicate arm. "Daddy, I missed you so much," Clara whispered, hiding her face in his chest. Bernard kissed the top of his daughter's head, feeling a mix of relief and concern. "Me too, my little maestro. More than you can imagine." Turning his gaze back to Deborah, Bernard tried to process what he had just witnessed. Just 2 years ago, when they married, Deborah seemed like the perfect solution to fill the void Marianne had left. As his manager, she knew his routine, admired his work, and apparently had developed a genuine affection for Clara. Or at least, that's what he believed. "Clara, why don't you go show your drawings to Mrs. Eleanor? I'm sure she missed you too," Bernard said, referring to the housekeeper who had looked after Clara since she was a baby. As soon as the girl left, Bernard confronted Deborah. "What happened to 'I'll take care of her as if she were my own daughter'?" Deborah adjusted her impeccable dress and ran a hand through her smooth, dyed blonde hair. "Bernard, don't dramatize. I was just teaching the girl boundaries. She needs to learn to respect things. Holding her like that, yelling at her? You know how exaggerated children can be. Clara has too much imagination, like her mother." Deborah's tone when mentioning Marianne carried poorly disguised disdain. "Besides, we need to talk about her education. That alternative school isn't working. She spends her day drawing and singing instead of learning useful things." Bernard felt the travel fatigue weigh even more heavily on his shoulders. "We're not discussing this now. I need a shower and some rest." That night, while Deborah organized a dinner to celebrate his return, Bernard went to Clara's room. The decor, chosen by Marianne before her passing, remained intact. Pastel-toned walls, light wood furniture, and a small bookshelf filled with children's books. Scattered on the bed were several colorful drawings. "What are these, Clara?" Bernard asked, sitting beside his daughter. "They're memories of Mommy," the girl replied, showing a drawing where 3 stick figures, 1 large and 2 small, held what appeared to be musical instruments. "That's you, that's me, and that's Mommy in heaven, playing the violin with us." Bernard felt a lump in his throat. "It's beautiful, my little one. Your mother would have loved it." "Aunt Deborah said that drawing people who aren't here anymore is silly, childish stuff." Clara's voice trembled slightly. "She hid Mommy's portrait that used to be in the music room." Before Bernard could respond, Mrs. Eleanor, a 60-year-old black woman who was more family than employee, appeared at the door. "Time for your bath, young lady. Your father needs to get ready for dinner." As Clara went with Eleanor, Bernard remained seated, looking at the drawings. Something was wrong. Very wrong. How had he not noticed before? The letters Deborah wrote in his name during his trips, supposedly dictated by Clara, always mentioned how happy and well-adjusted the girl was. The few times he managed to speak to his daughter on the phone, the conversations were short and superficial, always with Deborah nearby. Dinner proceeded in an atmosphere of false normalcy. Deborah, impeccable in her designer dress, spoke animatedly about the new opportunities she had secured for Bernard. A performance at the opening of the Aspen Winter Music Festival, a North American tour, a composition for the soundtrack of an international film. "In fact," Deborah said, pouring more wine, "we need to leave for New York in 2 days. The film producer wants to personally discuss the contract details." 2 days? I just got here, Deborah. It's a unique opportunity, darling. The film has Oscar potential. Imagine your music being recognized worldwide. Clara, sitting silently at the table, played with the food on her plate. "Eat properly, girl," Deborah reprimanded. "You look like you have no manners." Bernard observed his wife's behavior with his daughter throughout dinner, noticing how Clara seemed to shrink whenever Deborah spoke louder or made a sudden movement. It wasn't the natural behavior of a 6-year-old. It was the reflection of someone who was afraid. Later that night, while Deborah slept, Bernard went to his study and called his longtime friend, Paul Miller, current director of the Savannah Symphony Orchestra and a retired doctor. "I need some advice, Paul," Bernard said after briefly explaining the situation. "I'm worried about Clara." "Bring her in for a checkup tomorrow. I can examine her discreetly," Paul suggested. "Meanwhile, observe. Children don't lie about these kinds of things, Bernard." The next day, Bernard took Clara for a stroll through historic Charleston, walking along the cobblestone streets, visiting the old churches and local artists' studios. Away from Deborah's watchful eyes, Clara seemed like a different child. She spoke animatedly, laughed, ran, but whenever Bernard mentioned they would have to go home, the sparkle in her eyes faded. "Daddy, are you leaving again?" Clara asked as they savored ice cream made from typical regional fruits, sitting on a bench in Forsyth Park. "Just for a few days, my love. I have important work." Clara lowered her head. "Aunt Deborah said you prefer music over me." "That's why you're always traveling." The words hit Bernard like a punch. "Clara, that's not true. You are the most important thing in my life. Then why do you leave and let me stay with her? She doesn't like me, Daddy." A tear rolled down the girl's face. "She only likes me when there are visitors. Then she says I'm the daughter she never had." Bernard spent the rest of the day with Clara, carefully observing every reaction, every unspoken word. They visited Paul Miller's studio, who, besides being a maestro and doctor, was a talented painter in his spare time. While Clara enjoyed herself with the paints and canvases Paul had provided, the two friends talked in low voices. "Bernard, I've had cases like this at the hospital," Paul commented, while pretending to help Clara with her drawing. "Some children suffer silent abuse, the kind that leaves no visible marks but destroys self-confidence. I'm worried about what you told me." The maestro watched his daughter, absorbed in the pleasure of mixing colors in movements that resembled the way he conducted the orchestra. The resemblance to Marianne was striking. The same concentrated gaze, the same passion for artistic expression. "I'm postponing this trip," Bernard decided. "I can't leave her now." "Be discreet," Paul advised. "If Deborah is really mistreating Clara, she'll deny it and become more careful. We need evidence." Upon returning home, they found Deborah on the veranda, sipping iced tea while flipping through a decoration magazine. Her smile didn't reach her eyes when she greeted her husband and stepdaughter. "I've been thinking, darling," she said, completely ignoring Clara's presence. "Maybe it's better if you go to New York alone. I can stay and take care of Clara. I know how clumsy you men are with children." A shiver ran down Bernard's spine. "I don't know, Deborah. Maybe we should hire a temporary nanny. You also have a lot of commitments." "Nonsense," Deborah smiled, a cold smile that didn't match her well-made-up face. "Clara and I will have a lot of fun, won't we, dear?" The girl squeezed her father's hand and didn't respond. That silence told Bernard more than any words could. That night, Bernard tried to talk to Mrs. Eleanor, who had worked for the family for over 20 years. "How has Clara been behaving when I'm away, Eleanor?" The housekeeper hesitated, looking nervously around as if afraid of being overheard. "Mr. Bernard, don't make me say what could cost me my job. I have my grandchildren to support. Eleanor, you've known me since I was a child. Please, if something is happening to Clara," the woman sighed deeply, "Mrs. Deborah, she changes when you're not here. She becomes cold, controlling. She hides the girl's drawings, throws away the tapes she records singing for you, says she needs to grow up and stop living in a fantasy world." Eleanor lowered her voice even further. "Once, she took all of Mrs. Marianne's photos that the girl kept and said she was going to burn them. She only didn't burn them because I begged and hid them in my room." Bernard felt his blood boil. "Why didn't you ever tell me this before? She controls everything, sir. The letters, the phone calls. Once I tried to call you, and she caught me. She threatened to report me for theft if I tried again." Eleanor wiped away a tear. "I've seen a lot in this life, Mr. Bernard, but the way she looks at Clara, it's not a mother's look nor a stepmother's. It's the look of someone who is envious." The next morning, Bernard announced that he would not be going to New York. Deborah reacted with contained fury, poorly disguised by her artificial smile. "You know what's at stake, don't you? This contract could define your international career." "My daughter is more important than any contract, Deborah." She narrowed her eyes. "Your daughter or Marianne's memories? Sometimes I wonder who I really married, you or the ghost of your deceased wife." The words struck Bernard like sharp knives. There was truth in them. Part of his heart had left with Marianne. But Clara was real, alive, and needed him now. "I'll go to New York," he said finally, "but I'll take Clara with me." Deborah let out a short laugh. "And who will take care of her while you're in meetings? Will you take her to studios, to cocktail parties? Be realistic, Bernard. A child needs stability, routine." The discussion lasted for hours. In the end, exhausted and pressured by the producer who had already rescheduled the meeting twice, Bernard conceded. He would go alone, but only for 3 days, not a week as Deborah had initially planned. On the eve of his departure, Bernard prepared Clara for his absence. "It'll only be 3 days, Princess. I promise I'll be back quickly." "Can I stay with Mrs. Eleanor the whole time, or?" Clara asked, her eyes pleading. "Yes, I've arranged everything with her," Bernard lied, knowing Deborah would never allow such an arrangement, but determined to keep his daughter calm. "And when I get back, we'll start composing that song you wanted, remember?" Clara smiled shyly. "The butterfly song? That's the one. I'll bring a special notebook from New York, just for us to write down our ideas." That same night, after Clara fell asleep, Bernard discreetly installed a small recorder in his daughter's room and another in the music room, a precaution Paul had suggested. If Deborah was truly mistreating Clara, there would be evidence. What Bernard didn't know was that Deborah, while he was saying goodbye to Clara, had already begun to implement her own changes. As soon as Bernard's car disappeared around the bend of the Charleston Hill, the atmosphere in the house changed drastically. "Starting today, we'll have new rules," Deborah announced to Clara and Eleanor, seated at the breakfast table. "Clara, you're not going to school this week. We'll study at home." "But, Mom, the school is expecting the girl," Eleanor protested. "I've already called to say she has a virus," Deborah cut in. "Besides, Eleanor, you're dismissed for 3 days. Your sister called me saying she's sick and needs care." "My sister?" Eleanor frowned. "But she lives in Asheville and is perfectly fine." "That's not what she told me." Deborah smiled coldly. "Your salary will be maintained, don't worry. Consider it paid leave." Eleanor looked at Clara, who stared back with wide, fearful eyes. "Ma'am, I think the girl needs me. Mr. Bernard isn't here now, am I?" Deborah raised her voice. "And while he's away, I decide what's best for this house and for this child." Reluctant and worried, Eleanor found herself forced to leave, promising Clara in a whisper that she would be back soon. The girl watched, helpless, as her only ally in the house disappeared through the door. In the days that followed, Clara lived a nightmare. Deborah locked the piano, hid all drawing materials, and established an almost military regime in the house. The girl was to remain in her room, studying advanced workbooks for her age, leaving only for quick, silent meals. "Your mother spoiled you too much, Clara," Deborah would say as she checked the math exercises she had imposed. "And your father continues the same mistake. Art doesn't put food on the table. You need to learn discipline, control, ambition." On the second day, Clara, desperate for some contact with her mother's memories, escaped to the Colonial Park Cemetery, a small burial ground where Marianne was interred. She carried with her a drawing she had hidden under her mattress, she and her mother playing piano together, with colourful butterflies around them. The cemetery, with its ancient gravestones and century-old trees, would normally frighten any 6-year-old, but for Clara it was a place of peace, the only place where she could speak freely with her mother without fear of reprisal. Sitting beside the simple grave decorated with a small angel statue, Clara placed her drawing under a stone so it wouldn't blow away. "Mommy, I'm scared," she confessed in a low voice. "Aunt Deborah doesn't like it when I play piano or sing. She said I'll end up just like you if I keep dreaming." "What does that mean, Mommy? Why doesn't she like music?" "Daddy always said music heals everything." The gentle breeze rustled the tree leaves, creating dancing shadows over the grave. Clara closed her eyes, imagining it was her mother responding. "Clara Allister!" Deborah's sharp voice abruptly tore her from her moment of peace. "What do you think you're doing here?" Deborah, wearing an impeccable pantsuit, grabbed Clara's arm tightly. Her face, usually composed to display a cold beauty, was now contorted with rage. "People will think I'm a terrible stepmother, letting you wander through cemeteries like a lost soul." She snatched the drawing from under the stone. "So this is where you hide these silly things?" "Please, Aunt Deborah, this one is special," Clara pleaded, trying to reach for the drawing. "Special? I'll show you what's special." Deborah tore the drawing into pieces, letting the wind carry the fragments away. "Your mother is dead, Clara. Dead and buried. And the sooner you accept that, the better for everyone." Clara watched, in shock, the colourful pieces of her drawing disappear among the gravestones. Something inside her also shattered at that moment, a small part of her childhood that would never be recovered. Upon returning home, Deborah locked Clara in her room. "You'll stay here until you learn to behave like a normal girl," she said, locking the door. "No dinner tonight. Disobedient children need to understand that actions have consequences." Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes dry from crying so much. The walls of her room, once cozy with their soft colors and cheerful paintings, now felt like a prison. Through the small crack in the window, she could see the sky gradually darkening, announcing a storm, typical of summer afternoons in Charleston. Her stomach rumbled with hunger. Since breakfast, she had only eaten an apple that Deborah had given her for lunch, claiming that girls who want to be artists need to stay in shape from an early age. But it wasn't hunger that bothered her most. It was the silence. Clara had grown up in a house where music was constant, where her father played piano every morning and her mother sang while preparing coffee. Now, the silence weighed like a suffocating blanket. To ward off the fear, Clara began to softly sing a folk song her mother had taught her, a Carolina folk song that spoke of the sea and the stars. Her childish voice, still in tune and expressive, filled the room with a little warmth. It wasn't long before the door burst open violently. Deborah entered, her eyes flashing with rage. "What did I say about singing in this house when your father isn't here?" "Sorry, Aunt Deborah," Clara murmured, shrinking against the wall. "I was just afraid of the dark." "Afraid? I'll teach you what real fear is." Deborah walked to the window and closed the curtains, plunging the room into near-complete darkness. "Perhaps then you'll learn that there are things far worse than the dark." As she left, Deborah took Clara's small bedside lamp with her, leaving her in total darkness. "Tomorrow we'll see if you still feel like singing," she said, before locking the door again. The hours dragged on slowly. Clara, wrapped in her thin blanket, fought against sleep and fear. The storm finally arrived, with thunder that made the windows rattle. Each flash of lightning briefly illuminated the room, creating frightening shadows on the walls. In the following days, the situation only worsened. Deborah limited Clara's meals, claiming it was for dietary discipline. The girl was forced to study advanced materials for her age for hours, and any mistake was punished with more hours without food or being locked in her room. "Your mother and father raised a useless little princess," Deborah would say as she checked the math exercises. "In the real world, no one cares about pretty drawings or if you sing well. What matters is if you're smart enough not to be taken advantage of." By the third day, Clara was visibly weaker. The lack of proper nutrition and constant stress were beginning to show their effects. Her eyes, normally bright and expressive, were now dull and surrounded by dark circles. Her hair, which Eleanor always kept neatly combed and adorned with colourful ribbons, was now tangled and lifeless. Deborah seemed satisfied with the transformation. Look, now you're starting to understand how the world works. No foolish dreams, no fantasies, just raw reality. For the first time in her young life, Clara felt something beyond fear. She felt anger, a deep, silent anger that kept her awake even when her body begged for rest. It was as if a small flame remained lit in her chest, fueled by the memories of her mother and her father's lessons about the importance of music as an expression of the soul. Late that afternoon, while Deborah was on the phone in her office, Clara managed to sneak out of her room and go to the kitchen. Desperate for food, she opened the refrigerator as silently as possible and took a piece of cheese and an apple. She ate quickly, feeling momentarily refreshed. Upon returning to the hallway, she saw the music room door ajar. The grand piano, covered by a protective sheet, seemed to call to her. Looking nervously around to ensure Deborah was still on the phone, Clara entered the room and carefully removed the cover. Her tiny fingers touched the keys with reverence, making no sound. She felt connected again to her father, to her mother, to everything that represented safety and love in her life. "What do you think you're doing?" Clara froze. Deborah was standing in the doorway, phone still in hand, her cold eyes fixed on the girl. "I just wanted to get out of there. Now!" Deborah's voice was low, but laden with a contained rage that was far more frightening than shouts. "Go back to your room and don't come out until I say so." That night, the storm that had hovered over Charleston for the past few days finally broke with full force. Lightning illuminated the sky, and the wind howled through the historic mansions. The steep streets turned into small streams as the rainwater flowed down towards the sea. It was amidst this storm that Bernard Allister unexpectedly returned from New York. The taxi barely managed to climb the slippery hill to his house. Soaked, the maestro paid the fare and ran to the door, protecting as best he could the folder with sheet music and the gift he had bought for Clara, a leather-bound music notebook in which he intended to teach his daughter the fundamentals of composition. Upon entering, Bernard was struck by the absolute silence of the house. Not even the sound of the rain seemed to penetrate the thick colonial walls. He called for Deborah, for Clara, for Eleanor. No one answered. The house was in semi-darkness, with only a few lights on in the main hallway. "Deborah? Clara?" he called again as he climbed the stairs. The master bedroom door was open, the bed perfectly made, with no sign of his wife. Worried, Bernard went to Clara's room. The door was locked from the outside. "Clara, are you in there, sweetheart?" he called, knocking lightly. A faint sound came from inside, something between a whimper and a sigh. Bernard felt his heart race. He looked for the key on the door frame where it usually was, but didn't find it. Determined, he used his body weight to force the door, which gave way after a few tries. What he saw made his blood run cold. Clara was lying in a fetal position on the bed, wrapped in a thin blanket, visibly trembling. The room was freezing. The half-open window let in the cold wind and a few raindrops. There was no light in the bedside lamp, nor the toys that were usually scattered on the floor. It was as if the room had been stripped of everything that made it welcoming. "My God, Clara!" Bernard rushed to his daughter, touching her forehead. It was hot, feverish. "What happened? Where is Deborah? And Eleanor?" Clara slowly opened her eyes as if she couldn't believe her father was really there. "Daddy." Her voice was just a whisper. "Did you really come back? Or am I dreaming again?" Bernard felt tears in his eyes. He picked up his daughter in his arms, noticing how much lighter she was, how fragile her small body seemed. "Yes, my little one. It's me. I'm here. What happened?" Before Clara could answer, the sound of footsteps in the hallway announced Deborah's arrival. She stopped at the door, her expression quickly changing from surprise to rehearsed concern. "Bernard! What a wonderful surprise! We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." "What is going on here, Deborah?" Bernard's voice was controlled, but laden with growing anger. "Why is my daughter locked in this freezing room? Why does she have a fever? And where is Eleanor?" Deborah entered the room, adjusting the silk robe she was wearing. "Clara is grounded, darling. She disobeyed several rules in the past few days. As for Eleanor, she needed to visit her sick sister in Asheville." "Grounded? What kind of grounding is this? She's sick." Bernard hugged Clara protectively against his chest. "And what rules are so important as to justify locking a child in a freezing room during a storm?" "Bernard, you don't understand." Deborah's tone was condescending. "Clara needs to learn to respect boundaries. She's been rebellious, stubborn. As for the room being cold, she must have opened the window herself. It was just an educational punishment, Clara murmured against her father's chest. She's lying, Daddy. Aunt Deborah locked the window to let the rain in. She said she was teaching me what real fear feels like. Bernard stared at his wife, who maintained an impassive expression. Is that true, Deborah? Of course not, she replied coldly. The girl has always had too fertile an imagination. You spoil her so much that she can't distinguish between reality and fantasy. At that moment, a flash of lightning illuminated the room, revealing for an instant Deborah's face. There was no concern there, only a calculating coldness that Bernard had never noticed before. It was as if for a second the mask had fallen. I'm taking Clara to the hospital right now, Bernard declared, standing up with his daughter in his arms. Hospital? For a punishment? Don't be dramatic, Bernard. This wasn't a punishment, Deborah. It was abuse. The word hung in the air like an undeniable accusation, and if I find out she suffered any permanent damage because of this, I swear you'll regret it. As he descended the stairs with Clara in his arms, Bernard heard Deborah yell, She needs to learn. You and Marianne turned her into a useless dreamer. I'm saving her from her mother's same fate. Ignoring the screams, Bernard grabbed his car keys and went out into the storm, protecting Clara as best he could. He drove through the drenched city to the private clinic where his friend Paul worked. With each passing minute, Clara's breathing seemed more difficult, her eyes more distant. Hold on tight, my little one, Bernard whispered, his heart heavy with fear and guilt. Daddy's here now. Nothing bad will happen to you, I promise. Upon arriving at the clinic, Paul Miller received them personally, his face reflecting concern upon seeing Clara's condition. Bring a stretcher, quickly, he shouted to the on-call staff, and prepare examination room 3. While the doctors examined Clara, Bernard waited in the adjacent room, his hands trembling, his face marked by silent tears. How had he not noticed? How could he have been so blind? The clues were all there, the fear in Clara's eyes, the changes in her behavior, the rules Deborah mentioned in her letters. After what seemed like an eternity, Paul entered the room. His face was grave but not desolate. She's going to be okay, Bernard. She's dehydrated, malnourished and exhausted, but there's no permanent damage. The fever is the result of early pneumonia, likely due to exposure to cold and rain, but we caught it in time. We'll keep her under observation tonight. Bernard remained by Clara's bedside throughout the night. The girl was sleeping now, her pale face partially covered by an oxygen mask. The doctors had confirmed Paul's initial diagnosis: early pneumonia, dehydration, and mild malnutrition. Nothing that couldn't be reversed with proper care, but still alarming for a child who, until a few days ago, had been perfectly healthy. She needs stability now, Bernard, Paul said, sitting beside his friend in the clinic's small waiting room. Physically and emotionally. Bernard nodded, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration. How could I have been so blind, Paul? How did I not realize what was happening? People like Deborah are masters of manipulation, Paul replied, serving his friend a cup of strong coffee. They show the world exactly what the world wants to see. You saw the dedicated wife, the caring stepmother she pretended to be. But Clara, she tried to warn me. Bernard's voice failed. That day in the park, she clearly said Deborah didn't like her, and I left her there with that woman. Paul placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. Don't torture yourself, Bernard. The important thing is that you came back in time. Clara will recover. At that moment, the clinic door opened, and Mrs. Eleanor entered hurriedly, her eyes swollen from crying. Upon seeing Bernard, she rushed towards him. Mr. Bernard, thank God I found you. How is little Clara? Eleanor, I thought you were in Asheville with your sister. The housekeeper shook her head, indignant. Asheville, my foot. Mrs. Deborah invented that story to get me away from the house. I went to visit my daughter in Brunswick because Mrs. Deborah said you had asked me to take a few days off. I only found out what happened because Mrs. Clothild's neighbor called me, saying she saw you leaving with Clara in your arms during the storm. Bernard and Paul exchanged meaningful glances. Eleanor, I need you to tell me everything that happened in my absence, the maestro asked. Everything you saw or heard about how Deborah treated Clara. Eleanor sat down, wringing her hands in the apron she was still wearing. Mr. Bernard, I have something more than words to show you. She opened the straw bag she was carrying and took out a small device. After you left, I became suspicious, so before leaving the house, I hid my old cell phone on the bookshelf in little Clara's room. I set it to record when it detected voices. Bernard took the device with trembling hands. You recorded? Yes, sir. I know I shouldn't have, that it's an invasion of privacy, but I was worried about the girl. Mrs. Deborah had been acting strange for months. Paul helped Bernard transfer the files to his own cell phone. The three listened in silence to the recordings, Deborah's cold voice reprimanding Clara, threatening her, depriving her of food and comfort, making cruel comments about Marianne. In one of the most disturbing recordings, the words were clearly heard. Your mother was weak and foolish, and you're following the same path, but I won't allow it. I'll make you strong, even if it means you have to feel real fear. This is terrible, Paul murmured, after listening to the last recording. Bernard, this goes beyond mistreatment. It's systematic psychological abuse. Bernard stood up, his face a mask of determination and contained rage. I'm going to report her. I won't allow her to approach Clara again. Mr. Bernard, Eleanor timidly intervened. There's one more thing I need to tell you. It's not the first time Mrs. Deborah has mistreated little Clara. This has been happening for months whenever you travel. She hides the letters the girl writes to you, controls the phone calls, says you're too busy to talk. The revelation was like a punch to Bernard's stomach. All those months, all those trips, Clara had been alone, suffering in silence. And there's more, Eleanor continued hesitantly. Once I overheard Mrs. Deborah talking on the phone with someone. She was saying she would soon gain total control of the assets and that you wouldn't be a problem for long. At the time I thought it was just my imagination, but now... Paul and Bernard exchanged alarmed glances. Do you have any idea who she was talking to, Eleanor? Paul asked. No, Doctor, but it wasn't the first time I'd heard conversations like that. Mrs. Deborah always received calls when Mr. Bernard travelled, and she spoke softly, in code. At that moment, a nurse entered the room. Mr. Alistair, your daughter woke up and is asking for you. Bernard rushed to the room where Clara was hospitalized. The girl, still pale but with more alert eyes, smiled weakly upon seeing him. Daddy, you didn't leave. Never again, my little one. Bernard held his daughter's hand, kissing it delicately. I'll never leave you alone again. Clara looked around, apprehensive. Aunt Deborah isn't here, is she? No, my love, she won't hurt you anymore. The girl relaxed visibly. Can I play piano again? And sing? She said that was for weak people. Bernard felt his heart ache. Of course you can, Clara. Music is what makes us strong, not weak. Your mother knew that, I know that, and you know that too. While Clara rested, Bernard, Paul, and Eleanor discussed the next steps. The gravity of the situation required more than a simple report. Clara needed to be protected immediately and permanently. I'm going to hire a lawyer specializing in family law, Bernard decided. We need an urgent protective order. I know someone who can help, Paul offered. Felicity Caldwell, one of Savannah's best lawyers. She specializes in cases of domestic violence and child abuse. The next day, Felicity Caldwell arrived at the clinic, a middle-aged woman with stylishly cut grey hair and keen eyes behind colorful framed glasses. She exuded competence and compassion. Mr. Alistair, I've heard the recordings Mrs. Eleanor made, Felicity said after the initial introductions. We have a solid case for an emergency protective order, but I need to ask you something delicate. Does your wife have any financial interest in your assets? Bernard reflected for a moment. Well, we have a prenuptial agreement, but it provides for a division of assets acquired during the marriage, and Deborah is my manager. She handles my contracts, performances, copyrights. Does that mean she has access to your accounts, documents, financial information? Yes, complete. Felicity exchanged a meaningful glance with Paul. I believe we're dealing with something bigger than child abuse, Mr. Alistair. Your wife might be trying to isolate you from your daughter for financial reasons. What do you mean? It's a pattern I've seen before. The abuser isolates the victim from loved ones, manipulates information, creates an environment of fear and dependence. In your daughter's case, the abuse could be part of a plan to distance her from you, undermining your relationship. At the same time, as your manager, Deborah controls your career and finances. The theory made terrible sense to Bernard. He remembered how, in recent months, Deborah had insisted that he accept more international tours, contracts that would keep him away from home for increasingly longer periods. He also remembered the subtle comments she made about Clara's behavior, implying that the girl was becoming problematic, difficult to handle. We need to investigate further, Felicity concluded. I'll request the protective order today and start the divorce proceedings, but I also recommend hiring a private investigator to check Deborah's financial activities. Paul recommended Regina Stone, a former police officer who now worked as a private investigator. Specializing in financial and family fraud cases, Regina had the discretion and experience necessary to handle such a delicate situation. 3 days later, Regina presented her initial findings. The group, Bernard, Paul, Felicity and Regina, met at the lawyer's office in downtown Savannah. "Mr. Alistair, what I've discovered is troubling," Regina began, opening a folder with documents. "Your wife isn't acting alone. There are at least 2 accomplices involved." "Accomplices? Who?" "Roderick Maxwell, a music producer who worked with you at the beginning of your career, and Lucy Fisher, former accountant for the Savannah Symphony Orchestra." Bernard recognized the names immediately. Roderick was a producer who had been fired years ago for embezzling funds from a festival Bernard organized. Lucy had been discovered altering the orchestra's financial records and was dismissed about 5 years ago. "What do they have to do with Deborah?" Regina showed copies of bank transfers, emails, and text messages. They formed a kind of alliance. "Based on the communications I intercepted, the plan seems to be this: isolate you from your daughter, making you believe she's well cared for while increasing your international engagement schedule. At the same time, they're preparing documents that would give Deborah full power of attorney over your assets and copyrights. But for that, I would need to sign—" "Exactly. And here's the most troubling part. I found evidence that they plan to simulate Clara's disappearance." Bernard felt his blood run cold. "What do you mean, disappearance?" "A fake kidnapping, apparently. They would create a situation where you would be emotionally vulnerable, worried about your daughter, and then present documents for your signature, claiming they were necessary to resolve the situation. Documents that, in reality, would transfer control of your assets and career to Deborah." Paul placed a hand on his friend's shoulder, who seemed about to collapse. "Bernard, take a deep breath. Clara is safe now." "How can people be so cruel?" Bernard murmured, staring at the documents in front of him. "To use an innocent child like that." "Money and resentment are powerful motivators," Regina replied. "Roderick and Lucy lost their careers because of their own actions, but they blame you. Deborah, in turn, seems to have approached you from the beginning with ulterior motives." Felicity intervened. "With this evidence, we can not only secure the protective order for Clara, but also initiate criminal proceedings against the 3 for conspiracy, attempted fraud, and child abuse." "What should we do now?" Bernard asked. "First, ensure Clara's safety," Felicity replied. "Then gather more evidence, and finally confront those responsible legally." While the group discussed strategies, Bernard received a call from the hospital. Clara had shown significant improvement and could be discharged the next day. The news brought a moment of joy amidst the storm of revelations. "I'll take her far from here," Bernard decided, "perhaps to the beach house on Hilton Head Island where Deborah has never been." Regina shook her head. "I don't recommend it, Mr. Alistair. If they suspect you've discovered the plan, they might act rashly. It's best to maintain an appearance of normalcy while we set up our strategy." "I agree," Felicity said. "Besides, Clara needs stability now. Abrupt changes could be detrimental to her psychological recovery." "So what do you suggest?" "Go back home with Clara," Regina proposed. "My team and I will set up a discreet surveillance scheme. Felicity has already secured the protective order, which means Deborah won't be able to approach Clara. Keep Eleanor close by and hire nurses for additional care. Meanwhile, we'll continue gathering evidence and preparing the legal case." Bernard reluctantly agreed. The idea of returning home to the same environment where Clara had suffered deeply bothered him, but he understood the logic of the plan. The next morning, after being discharged, Clara seemed apprehensive about the idea of going home. "Will Aunt Deborah be there, Daddy?" "No, my love. She can never come near you again. It's a promise." Bernard knelt to be at his daughter's height. "And you know what? I'm going to stay home with you for a long time. No trips, no distant concerts, just the 2 of us, making music together." Clara's eyes lit up for the first time in days. "Can we finish the butterfly song?" "Of course we can, and we'll do much more than that." The return home was harder than Bernard had imagined. Although Deborah wasn't there, the protective order had forced her to leave the residence. Her presence still lingered in the rooms, in the personal items that remained in drawers and cupboards, In the paintings she had chosen to replace Marianne's photographs. Clara hesitated upon entering, holding her father's hand tightly. "It's all right, little one," Bernard assured her. "The house is ours now." Eleanor was already waiting for them, having transformed the place in the few hours she had since learning of Clara's discharge. The windows were open, allowing the sea breeze to enter freely. The scent of fresh flowers replaced Deborah's expensive and suffocating perfume. And more importantly, the piano in the music room was uncovered, tuned, ready to be played again. "Welcome back," the housekeeper said, hugging Clara affectionately. "I made that corn cake you love so much, little Clara." The first week was one of readjustment. Clara still woke up during the night, startled by nightmares. Bernard slept in an armchair beside his daughter's bed, ready to comfort her at any moment. During the day, they followed a calm routine. Breakfast prepared by Eleanor, respiratory physiotherapy sessions for Clara, a sequela of pneumonia, moments of reading together, and most importantly, lots of music. Bernard discovered that playing the piano had an almost medicinal effect on his daughter. When the maestro's fingers danced across the keyboard, Clara's eyes came alive, her body visibly relaxed. Gradually, she began to join him on the piano bench, first just observing, then playing simple notes until they finally started composing the promised Butterfly song together. While father and daughter rebuilt their relationship, Regina Stone and her team worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Discreet surveillance cameras were installed around the property. A security system was implemented, with silent alarms that would alert both Regina's team and the police in case of an attempted invasion. 2 agents took turns in a car parked nearby, observing any suspicious activity. The investigations continued to reveal disturbing details of Deborah and her accomplices' plan. Regina uncovered suspicious financial transactions, money being moved from Bernard's investment funds to offshore accounts, contracts altered to increase Deborah's commission as his manager, copyrights for compositions being registered with her co-authorship without the maestro's knowledge. "She had been preparing this for at least a year," Regina explained during a meeting with Bernard and Felicity, "taking advantage of your trust and your long absences due to tours." "How could I have been so naive?" Bernard lamented. "Don't blame yourself," Felicity replied. "Deborah is a skilled manipulator. People like that are experts at gaining the trust of their victims." One of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation was the discovery that Deborah had hired a private investigator to gather information about the accident that claimed the life of Marianne, Bernard's first wife. It wasn't clear what her objective was, but the notes found suggested an attempt to rewrite the narrative of the accident, possibly to use it against Bernard in some way. "She was trying to construct an alternative story," Regina theorized, "perhaps to suggest that you bore some responsibility for your first wife's passing, which could affect Clara's custody in case of a legal dispute." The revelation left Bernard deeply shaken. Marianne had been the great love of his life, and her sudden loss in a car accident had almost destroyed him. Only his love for Clara had kept him going. The idea that Deborah would try to tarnish that memory was almost unbearable. "We need to act soon," Bernard decided. "I don't want Clara and me to continue living with this shadow hanging over us." Regina agreed. "We have enough evidence for an arrest warrant, but we need to be cautious. They still don't know we've discovered the plan. That gives us an advantage." The plan was simple: continue maintaining the appearance of normalcy, allow Deborah and her accomplices to think their scheme was still in progress, while the authorities prepared to act. Felicity had managed to have the case handled with the utmost discretion by the judicial system, protecting both Clara's privacy and Bernard's reputation. However, as often happens, the unforeseen interfered with the most carefully laid plans. On the night of the 10th day after Clara's return home, Bernard received a call from Deborah. "We need to talk, Bernard." Her voice sounded strangely calm. "About Clara, about our marriage, about everything. There's nothing for us to talk about, Deborah. My lawyers will contact yours." "You don't understand," she insisted. "I have important information about Clara, about her health, things the doctors told me that you need to know." Bernard knew it was a lie. He had access to all his daughter's medical reports. But something in Deborah's tone worried him. "What do you want, Deborah?" "A meeting, just you and me, at the cafe of the Biltmore estate tomorrow at 10 a.m. It's public, you'll be safe." She paused. "And Bernard, come alone. This is between the two of us." After hanging up, Bernard immediately called Regina and reported the conversation. The investigator was clear. It's a trap, Mr. Alistair. She's trying to get you out of the house for some reason. Do you think they'll try something against Clara? It's possible. The original plan involved a fake kidnapping, remember? Perhaps they're adapting the strategy. Regina quickly organized a new security scheme. The surveillance team was doubled, with agents positioned at strategic points around the house. Eleanor was instructed not to open the door to anyone. Clara would not be left alone for a moment. "We'll pretend you accepted the meeting," Regina proposed. "Tomorrow you'll leave the house as if you're going to the estate, but in reality, you'll go to a safe location with Clara. Meanwhile, my team will be ready for any suspicious movement." The next morning, Bernard followed the plan meticulously. He left the house wearing a suit, as if going to a formal meeting, but drove only to the corner, where one of Regina's cars awaited him. Clara, Eleanor, and a nurse were already in the vehicle, which quickly departed towards a safe apartment in the Isle of Palms district. They didn't have to wait long. Less than an hour after the scheduled time for the supposed meeting, Regina called with news. "They made their move, Mr. Alistair. 2 men tried to enter your house through the back. We're following the plan." The plan involved allowing the intruders to enter the house, believing they would find Clara alone with the housekeeper, while disguised agents waited inside the residence. The intruders would be caught red-handed, which would give authorities reason to act immediately against Deborah and the others involved. Regina kept Bernard updated by phone. "One of the men has already been identified. He's Mark Davies, a private security guard who previously worked for Roderick Maxwell. The other appears to be a professional hired specifically for this operation." "And Deborah? Is she directly involved?" "We haven't seen her yet, but we have agents following her since she left the hotel where she's staying. She's at the estate cafe, apparently waiting for you." The operation proceeded as planned. The 2 men were apprehended while trying to enter Clara's room. The police found syringes containing a mild sedative with them and written instructions detailing how they were to take the girl to an address on Hilton Head Island, a summer house that, it was later discovered, had been rented by Lucy Fisher using a false name. Meanwhile, at the Biltmore estate, Deborah waited impatiently for Bernard. After a 40-minute delay, she began repeatedly calling her ex-husband without success. It was at that moment that she received a text message from an unknown number. "Plan failed. Police at the house. Flee." The estate's security cameras captured the exact moment Deborah's expression changed from irritation to panic. She abruptly stood up, dropping her purse and scattering its contents across the floor. Among the items collected by cafe staff were airline tickets to Canada in Deborah and Clara's names, dated for the following day, and a forged travel authorization with Bernard's signature. Deborah managed to flee before the police arrived at the estate. Her car was found abandoned near Interstate 26, which connects Savannah to inland South Carolina. Authorities immediately launched a search, issuing an alert at airports, bus stations, and border crossings. Roderick Maxwell was arrested in his Isle of Palms apartment that same afternoon. Lucy Fisher, who was at the Hilton Head Island house preparing the location to receive Clara, was detained hours later. Both, confronted with the evidence accumulated by Regina's investigation, quickly confessed the plan and implicated Deborah as the mastermind. For Bernard and Clara, the following days were about adjusting to the new reality. The maestro decided to remain in the safe apartment until Deborah was captured. Clara, though still frightened by the events, showed remarkable signs of emotional recovery now that she was permanently under the care of her father and Eleanor. "Daddy, will the bad people come back?" Clara asked one night, as Bernard tucked her into bed. "No, my love. They will never hurt you again. We're safe now." Clara hugged the teddy bear Paul had given her at the hospital. "Aunt Deborah said I was weak like Mommy, but Mommy wasn't weak, was she?" Bernard felt tears in his eyes. "No, Clara. Your mother was the strongest person I've ever known, and you are just like her, strong, brave, full of music in your heart." The girl smiled, her eyes already heavy with sleep. "Can we visit Mommy tomorrow? I want to tell her I'm not afraid anymore." "Of course, my little one. I'm sure she'll love to hear that." As Clara fell asleep, Bernard reflected on the events that had transformed their lives. Deborah's betrayal had been deep and painful, but it had also served as an awakening. For years since Marianne's loss, he had taken refuge in his music, in his tours, leaving to others, housekeepers, nannies, and finally Deborah, much of Clara's upbringing. Now, he understood that nothing was more important than being present in his daughter's life. 3 days after the operation, Regina brought the news everyone was waiting for. Deborah had been located and detained while trying to cross the border into Mexico using false documents. The police found her in a small hotel in El Paso, Texas, over 2,000 miles from Savannah. "It's over, Mr. Alistair," Regina said, with a tired but satisfied smile. "She will be transferred to Savannah in the coming days to face the charges." Bernard felt an enormous weight lifted from his shoulders. How did she react to the arrest? Coldly, according to the police. She showed no remorse, only irritation at being caught. Apparently her only comment was, "He'll understand one day that I was doing this for his own good." The maestro shook his head, still unable to fully comprehend the mind of someone capable of such calculated cruelty. "And now?" "Now comes the legal part," Felicity replied, who was also present. "The case is solid. We have evidence of conspiracy, attempted kidnapping, child abuse, financial fraud. Deborah and her accomplices will face a lengthy judicial process and most likely significant prison sentences." Clara, who was playing with her building blocks on the other side of the room, seemed oblivious to the adults' conversation. But when Bernard approached her after Regina and Felicity left, the girl surprised him with her perception. "Aunt Deborah isn't coming back, is she, Daddy?" "No, Clara. She was arrested. Do you know what that means?" The girl nodded seriously. "It means she did very bad things and now she's going to be in a place where she can't hurt anyone." Bernard hugged his daughter, amazed by her understanding. "Exactly. And do you know what else it means? That we can go back home now. What do you think of that?" The definitive return home was like a new beginning. Bernard decided to make significant changes to the environment. Walls were repainted with vibrant colors chosen by Clara, furniture was rearranged, and all of Marianne's photos, which Deborah had hidden, returned to their prominent place on the walls and shelves. The music room, in particular, underwent a complete transformation. In addition to the existing grand piano, Bernard added other instruments. A small violin, specially made for Clara's hands, a flute, a cello. The sheet music, which had previously been locked in drawers at Deborah's insistence, now adorned the walls in elegant music holders. "I want our home to be a place of music, Clara," Bernard explained, as they organized the sheet music together. "A place where you can explore, create, express everything you feel." The following months were for healing and rediscovery. Clara returned to school, a small, welcoming institution in Charleston that valued the arts as much as traditional subjects. At first, the girl was shy and withdrawn with her classmates, a reflection of recent traumas. But with patience and support from both her teachers and her father, Clara gradually returned to being the joyful and curious child she once was. The therapy sessions, recommended by Dr. Paul, helped enormously in this process. Twice a week, Clara met with Dr. Marina, a child psychologist specializing in trauma, who used art therapy techniques to help the girl process her experiences. "Clara is recovering remarkably well," commented Dr. Marina during a consultation with Bernard. "She has impressive resilience for someone so young, and music has been a powerful therapeutic tool in her case." Indeed, music had become Clara's primary means of expression and healing. Together with her father, she finally completed the Butterfly Song, a delicate composition for piano and violin that perfectly captured the journey of a chrysalis transforming into a butterfly. The piece became a symbol of Clara's own journey, from fear and darkness to freedom and light. Meanwhile, the legal case against Deborah and her accomplices moved forward. The trial, which lasted 3 months, attracted national attention, not only due to Bernard's notoriety as a maestro and composer, but also because of the shocking nature of the crimes. Felicity Caldwell brilliantly represented Bernard and Clara's interests, presenting irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy. The recordings made by Eleanor, the financial documents uncovered by Regina, the testimonies of the doctors who treated Clara, everything contributed to building a solid case. Roderick and Lucy, in exchange for reduced sentences, confessed all the details of the plan and implicated Deborah as the mastermind. Deborah, in turn, remained cold and calculating throughout the process. She vehemently denied the most serious accusations, admitting only that she had been strict in Clara's upbringing, but insisting that everything had been out of love for Bernard and concern for the girl's future. The most difficult moment of the trial was when Bernard had to testify. Before the crowded courtroom, he recounted how he had found Clara on that fateful night, weak, dehydrated, terrified. His voice choked as he described his daughter's psychological state, the marks the abuse had left not only on her body, but primarily on her soul. "My daughter was afraid to sing, ladies and gentlemen," he said, looking directly at the jurors. Her 6-year-old child, the daughter of musicians, was afraid to express the music that existed within her. That was the greatest crime committed against her, attempting to silence her essence, her heritage, her joy. Clara did not need to testify in person. Her statements were taken in private sessions with forensic psychologists and presented to the court in the form of reports. Bernard made a point of keeping his daughter away from the courtroom environment, protecting her from reliving the traumas during the process. In the end, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Deborah was sentenced to 15 years in prison, without parole for the first 10 years. Roderick and Lucy received lesser but still significant sentences, 8 and 6 years, respectively. "It's a just outcome," Felicity commented after the trial. "It's not about vengeance, but about justice, and more importantly, about ensuring Clara is protected in the future." With the legal case closed, Bernard finally felt they could truly move forward. He decided to take a sabbatical year from his international tours to dedicate himself fully to Clara and to a project he had conceived during the difficult months, the creation of a community music center for children who were victims of trauma. The Marianne Music and Healing Center, named in honor of his late wife, was established in an old mansion in the historic center of Charleston. With the support of the city council and several artists and entrepreneurs touched by Clara's story, the space was renovated and equipped with instruments, classrooms, a recording studio, and a small auditorium for performances. "We want music to be a path to healing for children who have experienced traumatic situations," Bernard explained during the inauguration of the center, "not just as a form of artistic expression, but as a therapeutic tool, as a language to express what sometimes cannot be said with words." Clara, now 7 years old, stood beside her father during the inauguration ceremony. Dressed in a light yellow dress that resembled the rising sun, she looked like a completely different child from the frightened girl of months ago. Her eyes sparkled with renewed confidence, and her smile lit up the room. "Daddy, can I show our song?" she asked, tugging on Bernard's jacket sleeve. "Of course, my little one. The stage is yours." Clara walked onto the small auditorium stage and sat at the piano. The first notes of the Butterfly song filled the space, delicate and hesitant, like the wings of a butterfly freshly emerged from its cocoon. Bernard joined her with his violin, and together, father and daughter presented the composition that symbolized their journey of pain and overcoming. There wasn't a single dry eye in the auditorium when they finished. The audience, comprised of officials, journalists, friends, and the first children to be served by the center, gave a standing ovation. Clara, once so shy, thanked them with surprising confidence. "This song is for all children who have ever felt fear. To remember that after the darkest night, the light always comes, and that the best way to chase away fear is by filling the silence with music." In the following 2 years, the Marianne Center grew beyond initial expectations. From a local project, it became a national reference in music therapy for traumatized children. Researchers from universities across the country came to study the methodology developed by Bernard and his team of therapists, music educators, and psychologists. Clara, now 9 years old, had become a kind of informal mentor for the younger children arriving at the center. With a unique sensitivity, she was able to connect with children who had experienced traumatic situations similar to her own. "Clara has a special gift," commented Dr. Marina, who now coordinated the center's psychology department. "She transforms her own experience of pain into empathy and understanding. It's extraordinary to observe her with the other children." Bernard had partially resumed his musical career, accepting only engagements that would not keep him away from Clara for more than a few days. His personal experience had also transformed his music. His most recent compositions, though still complex and sophisticated, gained a more accessible quality, more connected to fundamental human emotions. His Symphony of Hope, inspired by Clara's journey, was performed for the first time by the Savannah Symphony Orchestra under the baton of Paul Miller in a benefit concert for the Marianne Center. The work, divided into 4 movements representing fear, struggle, rebirth, and hope, received critical and public acclaim. On a spring morning, 3 years after the events that had transformed their lives, Bernard received an official letter. It was an invitation to participate in a hearing to review Deborah's sentence. After serving 3 years of her sentence, she had requested a reduction based on good behavior and deep remorse. "What are you going to do?" Paul asked, who was visiting Bernard when the letter arrived. "I don't know," the maestro admitted. "Part of me wants to leave this chapter behind completely. Another part feels I need to be there, representing Clara, ensuring that justice continues to be served." After much reflection, Bernard decided to attend the hearing, not out of revenge or resentment, but to close that chapter consciously and responsibly. Clara, upon learning of the hearing, surprised her father with her maturity. "You should go, Daddy, and tell her that we are well now, that we no longer need to be afraid of her." The hearing was brief and formal. Deborah, wearing the grey prison uniform, seemed to have aged a decade. Her face, once carefully made up, now showed lines of expression that spoke of bitterness and belated regret. When she had a chance to speak, she addressed Bernard directly. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. What I did was unforgivable, but I want you to know that every day I think of Clara, of the harm I caused her. Prison has given me time to reflect, to understand the monstrosity of my actions." Bernard listened in silence, his face impassive. When it was his turn to speak, he chose his words carefully. "I am not here for vengeance or to see you suffer, Deborah. I am here as Clara's father to ensure she remains protected. I cannot speak of forgiveness. That is a personal process I am still undergoing. But I can tell you that Clara is well. She survived what you did, and she is becoming an extraordinary person, full of compassion and music." He paused, observing the impact of his words on Deborah's face. "As for your request for a sentence reduction, I do not oppose rehabilitation programs or any measures aimed at your recovery as a human being. But I firmly believe that the time established by justice must be served, for the sake of all children who need to know that there are consequences for those who harm them." The judge upheld the original sentence. Deborah returned to prison to serve the remainder of her sentence. Bernard left the courtroom feeling strangely light, as if a final weight had been lifted from his shoulders. That afternoon, he and Clara walked along the shore of Isle of Palms beach, observing the sea in its eternal movement of waves. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink that reflected on the water. "Daddy, I'm not afraid of the dark anymore," Clara said suddenly as she collected seashells on the sand. "Neither of Aunt Deborah nor of being alone." Bernard smiled, deeply moved by the strength of his little daughter. "Really? And how did you manage to overcome that fear?" Clara reflected for a moment, her face serious beyond her years. "I think it was the music, and you, and all the people who helped us. Mrs. Eleanor, Uncle Paul, Aunt Felicity, Dr. Marina. I realized that we are never truly alone when we have people who love us." Bernard bent down to be at his daughter's height and hugged her tightly. "You are very wise, you know. Much wiser than I was at your age. Was Mommy wise too? Very much so. You have her eyes, you know, and the same way of seeing beauty in everything, even in sad things." Clara smiled, satisfied with the comparison. "What are we going to do now, Daddy?" "Now?" Bernard looked at the horizon, where the last rays of sun danced over the sea. "I think we'll continue our music, Clara. One day at a time, one note after another, creating the most beautiful symphony we possibly can." Weeks later, the Marianne Center held its first major public concert. On the stage of the historic Savannah Theater, in downtown Savannah, the center's children's orchestra, comprised of children who had found a path to overcome various traumas through music, performed for an emotional audience. Clara was the principal soloist, playing the violin with a sensibility that tugged at the heartstrings of those who listened. At the end of the presentation, after the deafening applause, she walked to the microphone. "This music is for everyone who has ever felt fear, to remember that after the darkest night, the light always comes, and that the best way to chase away fear is by filling the silence with music." Bernard watched his daughter from the side of the stage, his eyes welling up with tears of pride. In just 3 years, Clara had made an extraordinary journey from terror to confidence, from imposed silence to full expression through music. And in the process, she had helped dozens of other children find their own path to healing. The life he and Clara built together after the storm wasn't perfect. There were still difficult moments, occasional nightmares, days when memories returned like ghosts. But it was an authentic life, full of music, of true connection, of continuous growth. And that, Bernard reflected as he applauded his daughter along with the standing audience, was the true meaning of hope. Not the absence of darkness, but the certainty that there would always be enough light to continue the journey. A certainty that, like the most beautiful of symphonies, grew in complexity and beauty with each day lived fully, with each challenge overcome, with each note played with an open heart. Dear listeners, we hope that Bernard and Clara's story has deeply touched your hearts, showing how music can be a path to healing and transformation, even in the darkest moments. Their journey through fear until they found the light again reminds us that with love and perseverance, we can overcome life's greatest challenges. To continue experiencing emotions like these, we have a special playlist with other equally moving stories. Find it by clicking here on the side. If this narrative touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the beauty of overcoming. Tell us in the comments what you felt while following Clara and Bernard's journey and what other stories you'd like to hear in our next episodes. Your opinion is very important to us until the next story, with more emotions, twists and messages of hope.